Okay, good morning. Thank you for joining me again. We're going to take up the Gemara.
Good morning.
Good morning, on the story that we dealt with towards the end of last week, because there is a continuation to it. So I'm going to have to go back over it. And the Gemara here is on Mem Daled Amud Beis 44b. And it's a little bit higher than halfway down. I have to start counting the lines, do I? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. It's about 19, 20 lines down. I may have skipped. The first word on the line is minhag, minhag neviim who. Those are the first three words. And then we're going to, that's a full stop after who. And then Omar Ivo. And we're going to take the story of Omar Ivo. Just to remind you, the real topic of the Gemara had been this peculiar procedure of the Arava, the ceremony, and as to whether it was a Minhag Nevi'im or a Yesod Nevi'im at the time of the Beis HaMikdash, to take these large Aravot and place them against the side of the Mizbeach and all that, against which we have just a very vague minhag to commemorate it on Hoshana Rabbah, when we take our small Aravot and we wave them and then bash them on the ground. But the original procedure in the Beis HaMikdash was more ornate and was very special and took place all 7 days. And the Gemara left us really there with a question as to whether at source it was a custom or whether it was actually an institution. An institution is something that would carry more weight and would merit a bracha, whereas a custom wouldn't have merited a bracha. It would have been something that was done. And even though one doesn't break up customs, a custom in force, which has sense to it, remains in place. Nevertheless, there's no bracha. Now, the Gemara happens now, in this case, and in the next piece of Gemara as well, merely to bring stories that are related to the Chachamim, who we dealt with before. And we dealt with Ivo. Ivo was the one who brought a story about bringing an Arava in front of various Chachamim. And now the Gemara brings again Omar Ivo. Ivo said, and this has nothing to do with Sukkot whatsoever. And this is the Shemitah halacha. But because it was in the name of Ivo, is being brought, and it's therefore not contextual, but it's rather related to the same chacham. So Omar Ivo said, we did this very interesting case last week, so I'm not going to spend so much time on it, but just to bring us back to scratch. I was standing in front of Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, Osala Kameyahu Gavra, when that person or a person came before him, before Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, and I was observing the procedure. And he said to Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, I have a shaila for you. Kiryosa Isali, I have lots of villages and moshavim to my name. In other words, I'm a big landowner. Karamaya Isali, I have lots of kromim, lots of orchards, vineyards, and that sort to my name. Zeisai Islili, I have olive trees to my name. They all belong to me. And the local villagers who are in the Meshavim, which I own, they're the ones who work the agriculture of those trees and those vineyards and those orchards. And my shana is this. But also B'nai Kiryosa, I noticed that the villagers, the B'nai Kiryosa, the villagers of the little townships there, and Moshavim, come along, and this is on a Shemitah year. He's talking to him about Shemitah, Umekashkeshin B'charmaya, and they are hoeing around the fruit trees in the Kerem, which means they're sort of digging up the earth and loosening it, as one does, simply to loosen the earth around the edge, not to actually work on the trees themselves, but on the earth around the roots of the trees. And for their reward, for their salary, I don't pay them, but but they actually eat of the olives themselves. They take olives off the trees and eat them, which a worker is allowed to do, by the way. So that's not a problem. There's no theft involved over here. So he asks Rabbi Elazar bar Tzaddik, arich o lo arich, is what they're doing appropriate or is it inappropriate? And we said over here there are a couple of principles at play here. One is that this is the Shemitah year and they're hoeing around the bushes. And is that correct? And the second thing is that they're being paid from the Shemitah produce. And that is problematic in some sense because it looks like trade. Because instead of being paid in salary, they're taking their salary in the form of fruit, which is like cashing in the fruits for what is owed to them as a salary. And that looks a little bit like mescha, like trade. And was not allowed to trade in Shemitah produce. Even if you yourself aren't eating it, you're not allowed to trade in it. It's not business. It's only to be left for people, the aniyim, and for strangers who wish to come through the field. There's a degree of hefka. And hefka precludes trade. You can only trade if you're really in ownership of something. But if it's not under your ownership, which it should not be in the Shemitah year, you shouldn't be able to trade. As we see later on, the Gemara doesn't believe that either of these things are halachically really problematic. They're all just a little bit inappropriate, but not really problematic. On the one principle we mentioned before of Shemitah itself, they were not actually working on the trees. They were not improving the trees. So it's quite possible there was no Shemitah offense in the hoeing. So let's eliminate that as being a problem. The second potential offense was that the people were being paid with the fruits. And essentially this looked like a trade in Shemitah, in which you're selling, if you like, your produce to the people who want to eat it. Instead of paying them, you're exchanging payments for the monetary payments for food payments. That itself is also not wrong in itself, because there wasn't a stipulation. This owner who came to Ivo didn't say, I am telling them that they should take their payment in fruit. So there was no real trade. Trade is an agreement which is specified. These people have just decided they're happy to eat from the fruit. Well, that's like any other Shemitah situation where an oni, a poor person, can come out of the field and take. Anybody can come out the food and take. And why is their situation so different? So in terms of those two principles, there are no real violations of important laws here. However, it seems that this person who came in front of Elazar bar Tzaddik was unhappy, nevertheless, with this, and wanted to know whether, even though there may not be any strict violations of laws, was this an appropriate way to conduct oneself? And he himself, he was very frum, and he wanted to go lifnim mishuras hadin. He wanted to have very clean hands, if you like. And that's why he brings his question to Rabbi Elazar bar Tzaddik. So Amalei, we go on with the story. So Rabbi Elazar bar Tzaddik responded to this man, Lo arich, if you want to know the truth, it's not entirely appropriate. Not that it's osa. Remember, we're not using the word osa or mutar, because we're not talking here about full-fledged violations or transgressions. You want to know whether it's appropriate. I can tell you it doesn't look nice, so to speak. Someone wrote to me and said, does that mean this is, what's it called again now? Maris Ayin. Is that the problem over here? To some extent, it may be because of Maris Ayin. It looks as though you're trading. It doesn't look the cleanest way to organize your affairs if your workers themselves are, so to speak, taking their payment in the fruit rather than receiving a salary. But not everything is Maris Ayin just because it looks a little bit Maris Ayin-y. Otherwise, we would be almost banned from doing anything. However, he wants to know whether this is appropriate, not necessarily whether it's Maris Ayin, but should I be doing this? Is there a solution which is better than this, which would give me cleaner hands? And Rabbi Elazar bar Tzaddik says it's not entirely appropriate. Do something else. So at this point, rather than asking his follow-up questions to what should be done that would be appropriate, an appropriate way to pay the workers, he leaves straight away this questioner. So as the Gemara says, he turned around and went back to his home, and presumably to talk to his workers. And Omar, so Rabbi Elazar bar Tzaddik said to his Talmidim, including Ivo, who were there, who had been watching this incident and this exchange. He said to them, Kad havesi diary ba'ara hado arbin shnin, velo chamisi bar enosh mahalech ba'arachon de taklen kedain. I've been living in this land for 40 years and I've not yet seen a person who is so clean and straight as this man is. In other words, he's a bit of a tzaddik. This man comes to ask a shaila, and it's not about mutter or osa. It's not about can I or can I not. It simply is this appropriate for a person to do. And he's not a Talmud Chacham either. He just wants to do the right thing. So therefore, he's a very fine man. Not only that, according to the Mefarshim, the reason the man turned tail and left before asking what he should do to make the situation more appropriate was because he wanted to rush back to those workers to tell them to stop what they were doing. And he was in such a hurry to prevent even a split seconds further inappropriate activity that he didn't even want to ask his follow-up question. He went straight back. And now he returns back to Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok to ask the follow-up question. And he says, Hadar, the Gemara says, Hadar, he returned for Osin, came back for Amalei, and he says to, or he asks to Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, my miavad, what should I do to put things right? How should I administer the situation that I'm in now? I need them to work on my fields. What should I do? So Amalei, so Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok responded, make all your olives hefka openly. In a sense, they are already that, because there's a din of hefka on Shemitah produce. I mean, the din menach Torah, that's the way it used to be before we had, heter mechira and all sorts of other tricks. That the food of the Shemitah produce, that was real Shemitah, Kedusha Shemitah, was hefka for anyone to come in. Make clear that it's hefka to everyone. And then the same pritaya lekashkushe kromin, and pay in cash for these workers, rather than saying they can make it clear that you don't want them to take their salary in terms of fruit. Pay them in cash, and they won't do that. And this will mean that your hands are entirely clean. Because there will be no taint here of mescha, of doing business or trade with Shemitah produce. There's no cashing in anymore. They will get their money and they won't take from the olives for payment. So that's what he recommended them to do. And that presumably is what the farmer or the landowner went back and instructed his workers to do. From now on, I'm going to pay you for what you do. You don't assume that you should just eat and, so to speak, be yotza. I'm going to pay you explicitly for what you do. But now the Gemara asks the obvious question, and this is where we reached last week, by the way, reached this point. Why is the hoeing of the earth around the trees not a violation of Shemitah? What does Shemitah's karka mean? Doesn't it mean that you let your land rest? If you let your land rest, does it not mean you walk away from your field and perhaps you do the very bare minimum, but you don't do more than that? And yet over here, the Gemara in general didn't seem to have a problem with the principle of the hoeing. It was more a question of whether there was trade involved in the workers taking olives rather than monetary payment. But as far as the hoeing was concerned, there's no way that we saw Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok say, what are you doing allowing this hoeing? It's a Shemitah year. For goodness sake, leave the fields. He's certainly not telling them to do that. So the Gemara wants to know, why is hoeing not a problem? So this is where we are now. The Kashkushe, says the Gemara Mishori, is hoeing permitted in the first place? That the story seemed to have no problem with it. How can we say that there was no isor, no prohibition with hoeing? The Tanya, the Gemara is not saying this from nowhere. The Gemara is going to quote a brisa now, which is an authoritative Mishnaic source that suggests that hoeing is problematic on the Shemitah year. So let's have a look. For Tanya, did we not learn in a brisa the following? The Pasuk says, first of all, there's a quote from the Pasuk. The Pasuk says, it says over here, the Hashviyas Tishvatenu. Actually, the Pasuk says, Bashana Hashviyas Tishmatena Unatashta, that the 7th year, Tishmatena, you shall make a shmitter of it. If you like, you should leave the field. This is the basic din of shmitter, unatashta, and you shall abandon it. And how do Chazal learn that? They learn it as follows. The Brisa says, Tishmatena milakashkesh. Chazal say that what does it mean, Tishmatena? You should make a shmitter. You should leave it to rest, so to speak. It doesn't just mean leave it to rest. It means something more specific. We have to understand something specific as a halacha from this word. It means milakashkesh. That means you shouldn't even hoe. The Brisa suggests that the Torah implies we shouldn't even hoe, even though you're not working on the tree. You're working only around the tree in a certain way that is included as a prohibition, this Brisa says. So that's already our question. Hey, how could we assume that hoeing was okay? It shouldn't be okay. This is a Brisa. It's a very, very authoritative source for halacha. And the Brisa says here, no hoeing on the Shemitah year. Let's just carry on in the Brisa. The Brisa also gives you another thing you can't do. From the word unetashta, we looked at the word tishmatena, and we said that essentially the Brisa interprets that as a prohibition against hoeing. And the word unetashta, and you shall, if you like, abandon it or leave it desolate, that means milasakel. The Gemara, Chazal, learn a different halacha from the word unetashta. Again, what is it that you're not allowed to do? Obviously, you're not allowed to plow, and you're not allowed to reap, and you're not allowed to sow. But when it says unetashta, it means you mustn't even remove the stones from the field. Now, this is interesting. As you go through the year, and particularly in those days when the soil was quite hard, there were a lot of stones on the surface, and those stones somehow interfered with the penetration of the rain or whatever, or they just made it difficult to cope with the soil underneath. And this was agricultural soil. So the farmers generally would have done this thing, minasakel, skila, stoning. They would have taken away the stones. So they would have taken a shovel and brooms and wheelbarrows and nearly lift the stones up. And here we're learning halacha, which is, again, quite a chidush. Here you're not working on the soil even. You're not working on the tree, you're not even working on the soil. All you're doing is removing stones on the soil. Nevertheless, says this Brisa, on the Shemitah year, you shouldn't do these things. Well, let's not go into the details of Shemitah, whether you can or you can't. We'll see something that comes up straight away that'll help us to understand this Brisa, because it seems very, very severe. It seems you almost mustn't do anything on the field at all. But in any case, as far as what troubles us, is that we learned that there is a real prohibition against hoeing the surface of the soil. And that therefore, to start, the very first problem with what this man's workers were doing is that they were transgressing the Isser of Shemitah by hoeing. So why wasn't that a red flag raised straight away? So the Gemara answers, the reason it isn't a red flag, Amar Rav Ukva bar Chama. Rav Ukva bar Chama now answers, and this answer actually is quite an important principle in Shemitah. It's not just to do with hoeing or not hoeing, it's an important principle. So he answers this, Trei kashkushi havu. There are two forms of hoeing, two forms of kishkush. The Brisa said you shouldn't do kishkush, but that's actually an Aveira. But the story we saw before didn't seem to make a big deal at all about it at all. Why? Because there is a form of hoeing which is prohibited, and that's the one that the Brisa mentions here from the Posuk. But there's also a form of hoeing that is permitted, and it was that type of hoeing that was done by the man who asked the Shaila. There was no problem with that type of hoeing. What are these two types of hoeing? Chad setumi fili. One is covering up the soil so that to make sure that the roots aren't dried up. Essentially, it means, sometimes you do hoeing because you feel that the roots are getting a little bit loose, they're getting a little bit exposed. And what you do then is you try and tighten the earth around it, so to speak, to hold the roots more securely. The Gemara is trying to say that that would not be permitted. Before we understand that, let's just go on. What is the type that is permitted? The chad, that is permitted. That is permitted. That type of hoeing in order to cover up the roots and hold things secure is permitted. But chad, the other type of hoeing which is not permitted is avaruye ulene, is to actually improve the quality of the soil around the tree and to ensure that it becomes more moist so that it soaks up water better. And the Gemara says, Avaruye ilone oso, any form of hoeing that is going to improve the welfare of the tree over and above the state it's in now is forbidden. So tumi pili shori, but if all you're trying to do is cover up gaps, when those gaps would threaten the integrity of the roots, that is permitted. The general statement here is very simple. However you see it with hoeing, it will apply in every other form of agriculture on Shemitah as well. If you're doing something which will help the tree or the plant or the crop grow, so you're improving its welfare from where it is now, then that is a Shemitah transgression. However, if all you're doing is preventing the demise, the deterioration, and the death of a plant, then that is permitted. The Shemitah rules do not prevent you maintaining a crop in such a way that when it comes to it after the Shemitah year, it's still there. There is no din, there's no mitzvah to allow it to die. In other words, basic maintenance, you might say. Basic maintenance is permitted. And the Gemara's answer here very simply is that the type of hoeing which the person asking the she'ela brought to Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok was basic maintenance hoeing. And that's why there was never a problem. The Bryce over here that bans it, it says that it's actually a forbidden activity. It is a prohibition, is talking about the improvement form of hoeing. And as I say, it applies for any other form of pruning or whatever you do. If you have weeds that are beginning to strangulate your plant, you're allowed to work to pull out those weeds. Why? Because you're not working to improve your plant, you're working to enable its survival against an outside predator. The weeds are like an outside predator, and you can do those sorts of things. That does mean, obviously, that the labors that are permitted and those that are not permitted in Shemitah, it's quite subtle and quite complicated. You know, you need the right advice. So the basic things that we need to know are quite simple. But if you're a farmer and you have to know what you can do and what you can't do, or even if you, for example, are a gardener in a park somewhere in Gan Sacher or something like that, then in theory you need to know what is a maintenance activity and what is an improvement activity. One you can do and the other you can't do. So that's how the Gemara has answered it, and it's given us a bit of an insight to the mitzvah Shemitah. Now remember that we only brought this Shemitah story, we finished with this Shemitah story now, because the Shaila was brought by Ivo. Ivo had witnessed Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok in the people who came and asked him questions. And now the Gemara is going to bring another case of Amar Ivo. We carry on in the Gemara, Mishum Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok. Ivo bringing something the name of Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok. And again, this will have nothing to do with anything. So we're coming into a completely new halacha now, which is to do with Shabbos, Onek Shabbos, simply because we have the same, if you like, authors in terms of the story. Who are the drivers of this story? So Amar Ivo Mishum Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok. Al yehalech adam ba'arvei Shabbosos yosem shalosh parasos. Here's an interesting din. A person shouldn't set out on a journey on Erev Shabbos, Friday, which is for a distance of more than 3 parasot. If he needs to travel, let's say on foot, more than 3 parasot, he shouldn't go out in the first place. It's too far. So what's all this about? Well, as we'll see in a moment, it's to do with Oneg Shabbos. It's not so much that he might come and not get home before Shabbos, because we'll see that the journey allowed is actually a small fraction of Friday. We're more concerned that when he reaches his destination, wherever that might be, there won't be food ready for him. And he might well arrive at his destination, which could be home, or could be a hotel, or it could be an inn, or it could be a country cottage, or whatever he has, with not enough time to prepare his Shabbos meal. We're not concerned he's going to cook on Shabbos, because he'll say, well, I need a meal, and he'll carry cooking on through Shabbos. No, this is all to do with the wonderful mitzvah of Oneg Shabbos. He will have a rotten Shabbos. We want everyone to have a fun Shabbos. Everyone should have a meal prepared for them. A Shabbos is a time where you have Me'ein Olam Haba. So this guy is a frum guy. He'll arrive maybe in his destination an hour before Shabbos, kosher v'yosher, he's dressed and everything else, but not enough time to prepare a Shabbos meal. So what's he going to do? He's going to eat, he's going to eat berries and cake or something. And that's just not on for your Shabbos meal. So even though he's not going to be Mechal Shabbos, he will lack Oneg Shabbos. And in order to prevent incursion of this sort, that he might miss his delights of Shabbos, his food of Shabbos, we're actually going to ban him taking a long journey, which might prevent him from getting his meal ready. Now, there's a lots of qualifications, as we'll see as we go through this Gemara, because not every situation is not like every other situation. Not every journey is the same journey. Not every destination is the same destination. Not every person is well enough prepared in advance. We'll see how all those factors fit in. This seems like a black and white statement. A person should not travel for more than 3 parasot on the Friday because of the risk of him not being able then to prepare his Shabbos meals and be able to enjoy a fine Shabbos. So in terms of where we are now, before we introduce the qualifications, let's do some mathematics. 3 parsos. A parsa is 4 mil. A mil is 1,000 amas. A mile comes to the word mil. So 3 parsos is 12 mil, which is 12,000 amas. And so 12,000 amas is about 12 kilometers, very roughly, which is about, 8 miles or something like that. So you mustn't take a journey to your destination where you're going to be over Shabbos if it's more than, shall we say, 12 kilometers, which on the average person may be 3 or 4 hours walk. That's a maximum amount of walk. Let's see, we're talking about walking in a moment. We're not talking about taking a jumbo jet or anything like that. About 3 hours walk, which is, they say, about a third or a quarter of the day. That's actually short. We're not talking about here the risk of a person arriving at his destination after Shabbos. There's plenty of spare time. And yet, because of the difficulties of preparing food in those old days, not having fridges, not having proper cooked, and not having takeout supermarkets, etc., you needed a long time to prepare yourself for Shabbos. So therefore, this is a pretty extreme rule that prevents a person from taking a longish trip to where he's going to be over Shabbos. Now, some of the qualifications already, first of all, let me just share my screen with you. Now, of course, I don't have a mouse, so everything's more difficult anymore. My mouse has given up on me. Second. Okay. So we're going to be talking about Oneg Shabbos. So I've shared this screen. This is the source of it in the Gemara in the Sechet Shabbat, in the Sechet Shabbos. Just try and help a little bit. So, Omer Rav Yehud Omer Rav. Let's just do this source fairly quickly. Kol hama'aneg Shabbos nosden lo mishalos libo. This is from the Gemara. Where do we know the din of Oneg Shabbos from? Did I make it up? Is it just because you read about it in Zemiris? The Gemara here tells you what it is. The Gemara towards the end of Masechah Shabbos. Everyone who celebrates Shabbos in something that can be called Oneg Shabbos, delights in Shabbos, nosden lo mishalos libo. He gets fulfilled the desires of his heart. Shenerma, and we bring a posuk, I think from Yeshaya, v'his aneg al Hashem v'yitzin lacha mishalos libecha. He shall enjoy, in delight in Hashem, and if he does so, Hashem will grant the request of his heart. Oneg zeh, eineni yodea mahu. I may not know what is meant by Oneg Shabbos. What does Oneg Shabbos mean? Maybe it means I read the Jerusalem Post from nighttime to morning. Maybe that's my Oneg Shabbos, says the Gemara. No, in fact, far from it. Keshi omer v'korosa leShabbos Oneg. This is from Yeshayahu. You shall call the Shabbos Oneg. Oneg is a title for Shabbos. This is how you ought to enjoy Shabbos. It should be your Oneg. Have zeh Oneg Shabbos. This is what it means by Oneg Shabbos. By what means do you make your Oneg Shabbos? So Rabbi Yehuda Berei de Rav, Shmuel bar Shelas, Mishmei de Rav Amar. So Rabbi Yehuda Berei de Rav, Shmuel bar Shelas says in the name of Rav, and here we're going to see it's all got to do with food. B'tavshil shel trodin b'dogim, with a dish, a cooked dish of, I don't know, turnips and fish, gedolim, b'roshei shumin, and garlic heads. I mean, you may not actually feel this is the way you want to be doing your own Shabbos, but this is what Rav Shmuel bar Shelah seemed to think was the right way to celebrate Shabbos. Rav Chia bar Ashi Amar, Rav Chia bar Ashi said, Afilu dova mu'at, even if you have a small extra dish, which you have on Shabbos, which you don't have on a normal weekday. Yes, special Shabbos food. Remember, gefilte fish, cholent, all of that qualifies, but it's not in the Gemara here. Even if you had that, v'lechvod Shabbos asa'u, so long as it was made for the Shabbos, and it wasn't just the cottage cheese you had part of yesterday, hari ze'oneg, that is also oneg. Maihi Rav Papa, give me an example, says the Gemara, of a small, insignificant food, but which nevertheless qualifies for your oneg Shabbos, and the Gemara answers, kasa taharsana. I hope you know what kasa taharsana is. It's some sort of fish paste together with flour. I'm not quite sure I know what it is, but it's apparently quite easy to make. Take a few sardines or herring, mince them together and throw a bit of flour and oil in, and Bob's your uncle, it's all made. That I don't know, otherwise, I don't know what the menu is. If you want to look up kasa taharsana in someone's cookbook, maybe you'll find out exactly what the recipe is. But that's what the Gemara says about oneg Shabbos. So it's to do with food. It's not to do, if you note over here, with sleeping. You're supposed to rest as well on a Shabbos. That's actually also important. Menucha v'simcha. But oneg Shabbos is that extra taste that you get on a Friday night, and also on a Shabbos, particularly on a Friday night. That's oneg Shabbos. And if you don't have that, you failed your oneg Shabbos. And if you're on a journey and you get to your destination, but there's no time to make this extra food, then you're in trouble. Okay. Second. Okay, so this rule, for example, expressed in terms of distance of 12 kilometers, clearly refers to a person who's walking. Really, you should translate that into time, because it was assumed at that time most people walk to where they go. Yeah, if you're taking a fast car, interpret it as hours. So if we said 3 or 4 hours walk for 12 mil, 3 parsecs, that means 3 or 4 hours drive in the car. Yeah, you can, if you're on a plane, I'm not sure you can actually do a ride in the airport, out of the airport, book in, book out, get to your destination in 3 or 4 hours, but if you can. If it's a 1 hour flight, then maybe you can do it, and that may also be all right. Of course, there's another factor to take into account. Here, we're only talking about the risk of oneg Shabbos. If you're taking a journey which is quite possibly subject to big delays, and I think plane travel is maybe one of those things, that's an additional factor. The Gemara here is not talking about those factors. The Gemara is talking about where you're fairly certain that you'll be able to get to your destination in that average time of 3 or 4 hours, not where you're going through dangerous bandit territory or whatever it is, or you may run out of petrol and you're not sure. You don't undertake a journey like that at all on a Friday. Okay, here we're talking very strictly in relation to oneg Shabbos. Another thing that comes out from this is, even though it's not really clear from the Gemara, if you're going to a destination where your food will be ready for you, then why do you have to care about 3 or 4 hours? Yes, somebody else has cooked it. If you're on your journey home, the Gemara is going to talk about that. It's not so obvious. But if you're on your journey home and it's 3 or 4 hours, and at home, your wife has made a Suda fit for Shlomo HaMelech or whatever it is, then what do you have to worry about? As soon as you arrive home, it's there. There's nothing for you to do. A parallel would be, if you're going to a hotel, you should be able to go in the morning, 3 hour drive to Tzfat, approximately, you get it survived, you're in a hotel. There's no need for you to spend any time making things. In any case, nowadays, there are takeout stores where even if you were to arrive and you were only in a bed and breakfast, you could probably quickly go to a store and buy, as long as it was still open. So there's so many other factors. It seems that the Gemara over here is really talking about a very pure situation where you have almost nothing available to you rather than what you are able to put in yourself. So if you're going on a journey and you're going somewhere and it's unlikely that you'll be able to find something there and that someone else isn't preparing for you, then you need to make sure that you're there with very good time in the day. And what this is really demonstrating that in an interesting way is how seriously the Gemara is taking this Oneg Shabbos. We take Oneg Shabbos as a bit of a joke. It's Oneg Shabbos, so, but over here we have a halacha that's very restrictive in terms of traveling, and not because you might overrun Shabbos in your car, but simply because you might not be able to get the cholent ready. And Shabbos without cholent is a complete disgrace. That's what the Gemara is saying over here. So I think it's a very interesting principle you're learning from here, how important this Indian of Oneg Shabbos really is. It's taken to be. Okay, now the Gemara actually brings some of its own qualifiers into this. Not being able to travel more than 3 or 4 hours, as we said. Otherwise, don't go on your journey. So Amar Rav Kana, when does this law apply? This rule apply that we said, don't go out if you're going on 3 or 4 hours or more, because you won't be able to get ready for Shabbos. Ela leveisei. That's only if he's going home. Aval ushpiza. First of all, this is going to sound bizarre. And there's going to be another opinion in a moment. So let's do bizarre opinion first. Ela leveisei, it's only if he's on his way home. That's when he mustn't make a journey of 3 hours, of more than 3 hours, and gets home after 3 hours. That's not allowed. Why? We'll see in a moment. Avol, but leushpizei, if he's going to his hotel, ushpizei means his inn, it means his host. Now the Gemara is going to say something bizarre. Amai denokit samich. He's got the food with him. Now this is really quite strange. The Gemara is essentially saying that if you're going home, you have a problem. But if you're going to some other place, you haven't got a problem because you've got it in your own backpack. You've got it with you. So you have to sort of work backwards to see what the circumstances are that Gemara is talking about. Because if you're going to a hotel, the hotel food is there. So what does it mean you've got it? Amai denokit samach means not that your host is making it for you, but surely if you've gone out on a journey, you've taken your backpack with your provisions and your sandwich box with you. So the Gemara is talking about at a time when where you may only have been able to come to a lodging house and you'd stay the night there. But you wouldn't necessarily be given food. So you would not have made that journey in the first place if you hadn't already made provisions before you set out. And therefore, since that's the case, and you're going to a lodging house, and you definitely would have made provisions partly for the journey, and partly because you know you can't cook. There's no kitchen where you're going, you're out in a barn in the country somewhere, you definitely would have the food, and you'll have made your special food for Shabbos so that you can have more than, you can have a 6-hour walk then. We don't mind, because you've naturally taken your provisions for Shabbos with you. However, if you're going home, oh, that's a big problem. What's the problem with going home? Don't you have a fridge full of food at home? Why is that going to be a problem? So the Gemara seems to think over here, which it seems so bizarre again in our eyes, that if you're going home, you can't necessarily rely on the fact there will be enough food prepared for you at home. Why not? Because at the time with the Gemara think again, no WhatsApp, no telephone. When a person is going back to his home, even if he's got a family there, they don't always know he's going to arrive and they may not have prepared for him. So ironically, if you're going back home, you may not have made a provision, you may not actually take anything in your backpack because you will say to yourself, I'm going home, home sweet home. And then you arrive home and you don't have any of your special meal. Well, where's your Oneg Shabbos gone? There was no one to rely on at home. They didn't know you were coming. And you couldn't send a telegram, pre-telegram, etc. And you just surprised everyone by coming through the door. And actually, the Mefarshim say it's worse than that. But actually, Mefarshim say something very interesting. They say that in the old days, If a person suddenly comes through the door and he's unexpected, there's a real risk to Shalom Bayis. What happens? You come home, you, so to speak, the husband has come home, and he's come home 5 minutes before Shabbos, and he expects to find everything served. And of course, the wife doesn't know he's coming because they had no communication that he would be back before Shabbos. There might have been a chance, but certainly there was no certainty. And he walks through the door, and of course, the natural reaction would be, "Why didn't you tell me? Why couldn't you have sent me a telegram or something in advance to say you're coming? I haven't got food for you. We're going to have to share, whatever it is. The kids haven't got enough to eat." There's actually a risk. Yes, the people didn't have a fridge or take out. So therefore, there was a real risk. You only made what you're likely to eat in the very short term. And this could actually shake up. And when it comes to Shabbos, one of the reasons we like Shabbos candles is to do this Shalom Bayis, because there's light in the air, there's a romantic feel in the air, there, candles are burning, etc. That's missing if you suddenly crash in. So therefore, the Gemara bizarrely said, if you're going home, it's more risky, and therefore make sure you're not going on a long journey home. However, if you're going to some other place, since you're going to be prepared in advance, that's fine. I think we're learning more about the strange ways of Talmudic travel from here than we are actually in terms of halacha, because at the end of the day, we're going to see everything here is entirely logical, and it all depends. And what applied to them doesn't apply to us. But we're getting some sort of acculturation to the society of the Babylonians nearly 2,000 years ago. But there is another version which seems a little bit more logical. The Ikka to Omri, the Gemara said, there's another view that Rav Kahana didn't say what we just said. That going home was a problem, but going to your lodging house isn't a problem because you'd have taken your own provisions. There's another view that didn't say that, but Omer Rav Kahana, there's a dispute what he said. Lo nitracha ela afilu lebeisei. You may not even go home, but even more so, you may not go to another destination. In other words, according to this, you shouldn't even go home if it's more than 3 hours journey, because there is a risk that there won't be food for you ready. And even more so, kal v'chomer, you shouldn't go to an unknown lodging house, because at least if you go home, your family will move heaven and earth to find you some food. But if you're going to this inn, to this lodging place, you're going to land there and people are going to say, you're hard luck, there's nothing for you here. And according to this view, a person doesn't necessarily take his provisions with him in advance. And therefore, you're going to be stuck there with no Onik Shabbos. Anyway, these are the two views of the two versions of Rav Kahana. They lead us to very much the same place again. Where there's a risk that you're not going to be able to have food for your Onik Shabbos, then don't set out your journey. If there is no risk, then you can. In terms of halacha, it seems the halacha has basically thrown all this away as not really applying to us. I'm reading the halacha over here. Mishnah Brura says, whether you're going home or whether you're on the way to a lodging house or someplace, in theory, the pure halacha would be that you shouldn't really turn out. But in terms of the current halacha in our days, most people have the means to prepare food in much larger quantities, and that will be waiting for us. Whether we're going to a destination where we are guests, our host will be aware of us coming and will have prepared, or whether we're going home, then our home will be aware of us, we'll have a full fridge or whatever, and be prepared. So that therefore, this 3-hour rule, this 3 mil rule, this 12,000 amos rule, you can just see as being an interesting story in the Gemara now. And I think more than anything else, it teaches us again simply the principle how important the Gemara valued the idea of Onik Shabbos. For us, it's very easy to do Onik Shabbos because we don't have all these risks not being able to have the food available. So it's something we should remember as a principle necessarily, rather than as a halacha which is relevant. And Rav Kahana finishes up saying that he once was a miscreant in his youth. He says, it once happened to me. I have to admit, he says, as I admit this. I was late in arriving home or wherever I was going. I didn't obey this 3-hour rule. I thought I'd be a clever boy. And you know what happened? this minimal amount we mentioned in the Gemara before, of this fish paste or whatever it was, there wasn't even that ready for me. And on that Shabbos, I transgressed the Oneg Shabbos. Now, Oneg Shabbos, be careful over here. When you say transgress Oneg Shabbos is it's a din, but it's not as if you're going to get to Malchus or Chayav Misa or whatever. It's not a malacha on Shabbos. It's learned from the Nevi'im. So it's a halacha from the time of the Nevi'im because in Posuk Yeshayahu, which we take very seriously. But Rav Kana therefore said, because I wasn't careful, it happened to me. In other words, it can even happen to the greatest of people who try to be so makpid. Things can go wrong. And therefore, I didn't have any food ready for me. I may have had some dry, cold food, but it wasn't Shabbos food. If it's not Shabbos food, if it's just crackers, even though it may keep you alive, it's not a question of you're not going to eat at all. If it's not that special dish, then it's not Oneg Shabbos. Okay. Where are we now? Now the Gemara says, mitzvahs lulav ketzad. We've done our tangents over here. We're coming back to Sukkah again, would you believe? We're going back again. And this is taking up the Mishnah we learned a few months ago. And we're just going to see over here that there's going to be a dispute as to the correct wording in the Mishnah. This was the Mishnah that said how the Jewish people used to celebrate Sukkot and the din of Arba Minim in the Beis Hamikdash. Remember, it said that if it fell on a Shabbos, people used to bring it on the Friday, and they used to leave it with the Gaboim of the Beis Hamikdash, and then there was a fight the next day, etc., etc. The Gemara is now going to work on the Loshen there. And what I'm doing is, since the Gemara is not bringing back that original Mishnah for you, you have to look it up. So just to be kind to you, I pasted it into my sheet, and we can read it together. This is actually a couple of daf ago, and I'm only bringing this down for your comfort. A second. I wish I had a mouse. Okay, that's it. So it starts over here. This is what we learned at the quite a few months ago, towards the beginning. Mitzvahs lulav. What was the mitzvah of lulav? How did they take the lulav in the Beis Hamikdash? We're only talking about the Beis Hamikdash. And it was ketzad on a Shabbos. Yom Tov Harishon Shel Chag Shechal Liyos b'Shabbos. If the first day of Yom Tov fell on a Shabbos, Molichen es lulavehen lahar habayis. The people who were going to celebrate Sukkot on the next morning would bring their lulavim to the Har Habayis, to the Temple Mount, by Chazonim, and the Gaboim there. Not the Chazonim is not the Chazan with a good voice. He's only an official when it comes to the Gemara. Mekablin Mehem, they would receive their lulavim from each individual. In other words, those lulavim in their thousands would have been handed over, together with esrogim, I presume as well. It means Arba Minim, to the Gaboim of the Beis Hamikdash. The Sodrin Osad al Gabi Yitztabo, I've placed it in yellow, you'll see why later on. And they would arrange them on the platform or on the benches in the Har Habayis, V'hasagenim Manichen Eshalahen Balishka. And the elderly people who didn't want to ship too much, they were given a special room, chamber to deposit their lulavim. Umalamdin Osam Lomar, and they would teach all the people who would come the next day to declare, Kol Mishan Magia Lulava B'Yodo B'Matona. You remember this? You're not allowed to make a bracha on a somebody else's lulav on the first day of Sukkot. It has to be Shalachem. So how do you do this if thousands of lulavim are given in by individuals? How do you then find the one that was yours the next morning? The answer is you make this stipulation that I'm not sure what I'm going to get tomorrow, but I'm going to allow anyone who gets mine to be given to them as a gift. And everybody will say the same thing. So whichever one you picked up was essentially yours. That's the way they got over it. So what actually happened was, this is unfortunately where it all went wrong. When the folk came into the Beis Hamikdash the next day in order to collect their lulavim to get ready for the Sukkot davening, The Chazonim would take out all these thousands of lulavim and place them on a table to enable the comers to pick up a lulav at random, because after all, they'd made a stipulation which meant it didn't matter which one you picked up. But vehein mechatfid umakin ishas cheveru. But there was a terrible machlokas between people. Everybody wanted the best, or people wanted to still identify the one that was theirs. In other words, the stipulation was meant to make things smooth, but it failed because Jews are very argumentative, you may have noticed. When the Beis Din saw that in fact this was coming to blows and dangers, you know what they said? No more taking lulav and esrog on Friday afternoon to the shul to avoid carrying on the Shabbos. Everyone is going to take lulav and esrog bracha at home. If they want to come to the shul, to the Beis Hamikdash later on without lulav and esrog, fine. But we're not going to have them bring them in on Friday afternoon when it means on the Shabbos morning there's going to be warfare. Civil war between people coming in. So they changed the rules. Okay, that was the Mishnah we learned. The Gemara now is going to examine only that statement which I put in yellow. That's what the next piece of Gemara is about. This Vesodino Gabe Itztabar. Well, I keep doing the wrong thing. It's the yellow statement, which means that the Gaboim, when they receive the lulavim from the public, they place them on an itztabar. An itztabar really means a bench, but it can mean a platform as well. It's an Aramaic, probably from a Greek root. So that's what it is. So let's just do the Gemara, and then I'll show you what we're talking about. Let's carry on with the Gemara. It's not now on the screen, so just to make it clear to you, I'll stop sharing. So the Gemara said, mitzvahs lulav ketzad, quoting from the Mishnah. So, and I quoted that whole Mishnah for you, which is what you really need to know to understand the next few words. So the Gemara now says, Toni Tana Kamei de Rav Nachman. A Tana, a teacher, recited the following brisa in front of Rav Nachman. And we're only going to be reciting the words that I had in yellow. And he recited, Sodrin al Gad ha'Itztabar. That they placed these lulavim, the chazonim, the gaboim, on the roof, not on the bench itself, but on the roof over the bench. Let me just carry on. So Amalei, so Rav Nachman, who was listening to this from the Tana, who had recited this brisa, and here we actually move on to Mem He Amud Aleph at the top of the next Amud. What are you talking about? It was put on the roof, that they would place them on the roof. Did they need to dry them out in the sun? If you put them on the roof, they're going to become dehydrated. You're going to wreck these lulavim. Ella Amar, correct yourself, Mr. Tana. What you should be saying to me in terms of the version of the brisa is al gav ha'Itztabar, that they placed it on the surface of the bench, not al gag. There are two words very similar, gav and gag. The Tana had used the word gag, roof, and Rav Nachman says no, al gav. And that's the original Girsa that we learned, by the way, and that's the one I just showed you. But let me just take you back to sharing screen, and you'll see maybe you'll see what this is all about. So over here, this is the version that Rav Nachman would have preferred. Sorry, the Sodron Son al Gabe is the same thing. On the benches. The Tana, who had taught the Brisa, had used the words al Gage on the roofs of instead of al Gabe. And there's a difference as to where they would have put them. Did they put them on the roof, or did they put them on the surface of the bench? And of course, Rav Nachman says, how silly to say they put it on the roof. You must mean they put it on the bench. So let me just give you a view. Whoops, look at that. You don't expect this, do you, normally in a share. But what you get out of Google Pictures is extraordinary. So here's the picture of the Beis Hamikdash, if you like, from the temple model. This is the Azora. The Har HaBayis, there's the Heichal, the sanctuary, the Kodesh Kodashim is in this large building. But around the actual Beis Hamikdash, there's the Har HaBayis. And of course, the western wall would have been one of the walls, possibly, of a Har HaBayis, one of the mountain retaining walls. But at the edge, there's a huge space where large numbers of people would be. This is actually on the Har HaBayis, but not in the Beis HaMikdash, where my cursor is moving. But what you see around here, a huge colonnaded area on all sides surrounding the Beis HaMikdash. It's very grand, isn't it? These are colonnades. Underneath those colonnades, underneath that, it's in the shelter between those columns, there were benches. So those, the Itztabot, the Chazonim would have laid them out where they're going to put them. They're not going to store them over here. There are 100,000 people given over Lulavim and Esrogim. So they would have been stored on benches everywhere around here, underneath the roof in this colonnade area. Let's take you to the next. And here you have from one of the books written by the Temple Institute, the actual scene. There are people that love him. It's not terribly clear. Here are the colonnades. Can you see? We're actually in the colonnaded area. And the lulavim were kept here around on the floor, on the benches, under the shade of the colonnade roof. So, and this was hundreds and hundreds of meters long. So there had been a large, expansive area. Here we have people picking up lulavim. This is before it was banned, obviously. This is before the fights took place. But you can imagine that the officials of Beis HaMikdash had stored the stuff here, and this is when they're coming the next morning. They're coming down the stairs into the Har HaBayis from one of the gates, and they're going to make their way here to pick up Lulav and Nesrogim, and then they're going to go back again into the Har HaBayis. So what's this machlokus? So the machlokus then is fairly simple. According to the words of the Tana had recited this Mishnah as if to say that the bailiffs of the Beis HaMikdash, the Gaborim, had taken thousands of these lulav and esrog, and where they put them, thrown them onto the roof of the colonnade. Isn't that bizarre? Al Gagge, the only Gaggim you have over here are the roofs of the colonnade. And Rav Nachman said, no way. Al Gabbe, which means inside, because it said, V'chile Yabesh. Sorry, if you put them on the roof, they're going to get desiccated and dried out very quickly. Under here, they're sheltered from the sun. So clearly they must have been placed here rather than on top. I just take you back an interesting observation over here, simply that you have this idea that there is a Tana recites essentially a Mishnah or a Brisa in front of Rav Nachman. And I explained this before, that in the yeshiva, there were those people who were Talmidei Chachamim, who tried to understand the halachas and the reasoning behind Mishnayos to create an orderly structure. They're the B'nai HaYeshiva. There were also certain people who were employed, had extraordinary memories. They were data men, really. They were there because they'd memorized vast numbers of Mishnayos and Braitot, but the more Braitot, which are not in the Mishnah, and they'd memorized them. And when a topic was under discussion, the Chachamim would bring these Tanoim in. Their role was to recite and say to them, recite me a halacha from a brisa on the topic of the Rubik's Cube. But it wouldn't have been a Rubik's Cube, whatever it was they were discussing. And the Tana would just blurt out without thinking everything he knew. It was extraordinary. This is before writing, this is before printing, this is before recording. He was the recorder. He was the tape recorder. This was very, very valuable because they would then compare all the different versions they'd heard and they would discuss which one seemed to be authoritative or not. Over here, you have one of these memory men has used the word al-gagay, the roof. And why has he said that? Isn't that extraordinary? Why should they throw lulavam on the roof where they're going to get dried out? When you see the Tana himself didn't care why. The Tana was only reciting what he had remembered, what was in his memory, what he thought he'd received from someone else. Whether it made good sense or not was not in his pay grade. His pay grade was to remember, and he remembered much more than the sages around him. Yes. So he was the Google base. The Google doesn't tell you what's right or wrong, but there's a lot of information there. So he said something. Interestingly, is what you see. This is just a very good example of it. Rav Nachman says, what are you talking about? That doesn't make sense. It is the scholar's duty then to listen to what the memory man is saying and see whether the memory that he's extracted is actually sensible. He's the only one who can decide. It's not up to the memory man. The memory man recites it as he was given, even if it's gobbledygook. And Rav Nachman has said, no, this is not correct. It cannot be correct. Change the text in future. Don't recite it as al-gag on roof, but al-gav on the benches itself, because it would be bizarre to say anything else. So it's interesting. We have Rav Nachman has corrected the Tana, not because he has a different memory. It's nothing to do with that. Simply because he considers it to be nonsensical, and he's authoritative enough there to be able to amend a version based upon what is common sense, and not necessarily simply because someone's told him that. You can't necessarily believe everything you hear. It has to be processed. And Rav Nachman was processing this brisa he'd heard from the Tana. Just 1 minute longer, because we're going to read the Mishnah. Isn't that wonderful? So Amar Rachba, I'm just going to share the picture with you again for this final thing. We're on the last few lines here. Where is it? And you'll see from the picture above, or was it this one? No, from here, very well, very clearly. Amar Rav Nachman, I'm sorry, Amar Rachba, Amar Rav Yehuda. Har Habayis, Stav Kofel Hoya. On the Har Habayis, there was a double colonnade. There was a double column of colonnades. Stav Lifnim, Mistav. There was one row of columns within another row of columns. Well, I'm not 100% sure what it means, but look at this picture over here. There's one row of columns, and then there's another row of columns, right? Stav Kofel, a double colonnade. It's not just that they could have been just this set of columns, this that you see on the outside. It didn't maybe need another one inside. It might have been supportable without it, but there's another set. And this is just an observation. This is nothing to do with anything other than, since we're talking about the Itztabor, since we're talking about the structure of Har Habayis, so let me tell you something, that it was so magnificent that there was a double set of colonnades. And if we just go further up again, to see the picture. So here, you see it from on top, you see a different view. Here the colonnades again, there would have been another set, another 10 or 12 feet further deeper in, and you can only see here the internal set of colonnades, but there would have been another set. It was a magnificent structure. Let me just stop sharing, and I will cease recording. I can do it 1 second.